Good evening. My name is Holly Ridenauer, and I am going to be presenting to you this evening about medical marijuana regulations and the ethical concerns. Specifically, the focus will be on the state of Michigan. What to expect? I will do a brief history of marijuana in the United States, and then we will get right into the Michigan Medical Marijuana Act of 2008. We'll talk about some of the dilemmas and controversies associated with that act, especially associated with caregivers and dispensaries. And then we will discuss the new proposals and regulations and the next steps in their impact. So let's do a brief history of marijuana in America. Starting in the early 1900s, cannabis was in some over-the-counter remedies, but they all had to be labeled. By the 1920s, Mexican immigrants were bringing in marijuana for recreational use, which quickly began a stigma of the menacing marijuana. And by the 1950s, there was already a minimum sentencing that had been established for possession of marijuana for 2 to 10 years and up to $20,000 in fines. And the laws that supported that were the Bogues Act and the Narcotics Control Act. And then in the 1960s and 70s, marijuana became much more popular in the white-collar middle class, and there was kind of a subculture movement with this. Some people might call it the hippie movement, but regardless, it was a subculture movement, and it became much more popular and less controversial. Around that time, in 1970, NORML was established, which is the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, and that organization has made a big impact in other states, especially in California, which you see on this slide that Proposition 215 is when medical marijuana was legalized in California. But before that, in the 80s, the war on drugs was established by President Reagan and George Bush. And when President Reagan started the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, heroin and marijuana had the same convictions, which was life in prison after 3 strikes, which you can see quickly changed dramatically by 1996 with California legalizing medical marijuana. And then in 2017, where we are now, there are 29 states that have legalized medical marijuana, including DC. If you look across the country, you can see it's from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast and South. But now let's really talk about medical marijuana in Michigan. In 2008, the Michigan Medical Marijuana Act was passed. And what that law established is that it allows a patient to possess 2.5 ounces of usable marijuana and its equivalents, and each patient can cultivate 12 marijuana plants for their own use in an enclosed locked facility, or a patient can choose a primary caregiver who can cultivate those 12 plants for them, and the caregiver can have up to 5 patients, which would be a total of 60 plants, or 72 if the caregiver themselves was a patient and they were growing their own medical marijuana. So if a patient needs a caregiver to grow their marijuana, they're really reliant on this caregiver to provide that medication to them with a great responsibility. And with that responsibility for the caregiver also comes risk, especially when you consider it is federally illegal still under the Controlled Substance Act to produce for sale, to transport, or even possess marijuana. Transfers of the medical marijuana from registered patients to from registered caregivers to their patients, compensation is allowed. So quickly you start to see this gray area where these marijuana regulations exist. Another really interesting area has to do with overages for income. So if a caregiver has 12 plants, but they can only possess 2.5 ounces of usable marijuana, and they have too much, they have to get rid of it. So there is conversation about assisting other caregivers with their patients. That has been common in the industry. But is this any type of a business opportunity or a model for business? Well, in 2009, many entrepreneurs felt that way. So we'll just talk a little bit about dispensaries, little dispensary 101, if you will. So many entrepreneurs across the state opened places to assist other caregivers and patients with these overages so that a patient had a facility they could go into and purchase marijuana. Again, the gray area is just huge. And in 2011, the federal government warned these dispensaries that anyone involved in the practice of selling marijuana, medical marijuana, violated federal money laundering statutes and, again, the Controlled Substances Act. Also in 2011, the Michigan law enforcement really began to crack down on these dispensaries and began raids. And after the State versus McQueen case, which McQueen and his partner Taylor owned a dispensary, and they were selling patient to patient. And at that time, it was determined that dispensaries were not under immunity due to patient sales. And then in 2013, finally, the Michigan Supreme Court ruled against dispensaries entirely. But it's interesting that in 2017, out of the 283 dispensaries, only 175 had been shut down, but that was due to city ordinances and not due to the state of Michigan, even though they, in 2013, ruled against the dispensaries and labeled them legal. The Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs, LARA, they're not shutting down any other dispensaries right now. They are hoping for a gradual decline of the dispensaries that are open with the new regulations that are being proposed, which we will talk about in just a minute. And also because of the fear of the amount of marijuana that these caregivers have, having that just end up on the black market. And if you go to the dispensaries' websites, they still have overages policies posted right there. Really just incriminating themselves, showing that they are participating in these illegal acts, because every single sale is in violation of federal law. So when patients don't have a dispensary to go into, there are patients who are at risk. Patients such as veterans, pediatric patients, cancer patients, seizure patients. So where is this gray area to help patients that it has been determined they do need this medication, but we're not providing any outlet for them to obtain the medication? Not everyone has a green thumb, and not everybody has somebody who's willing to grow for them and take that risk. So without dispensaries, these vulnerable patients are not protected. And we're going to cruise through this slide really quick. But what is important to know is that there are 5 different areas that the regulations are going to really start controlling. That is growers, processors, provisioning centers, and safety compliance facilities and secured transportation. But there is a significant capitalization requirement for each of these, ranging from $150,000 for a grower to have 500 plants, up to $3,000 for a provisioning center, or $500,000 for a grower with 1,500 plants. And then the process, there's pre-screening, which includes financial history, criminal history, litigation history, tax, a whole big picture of what this person has been doing with their life financially and legally over the past, in their past. And so even before an application can be submitted to the state, a location cannot even be secured. However, that large sum of $150,000 or $300,000, that capital has to be available. And then there's many other additional costs with fees and assessments. But what about current caregivers who do not have that type of capital in order to apply for an application to grow and turn this into a business that they had been hoping? The LARA board, they have some conflicting opinions on that. Some of the opinions that I thought were interesting have to do with it not with the dispensaries and the laws not being, with the new regulations, not being parallel to similar businesses such as pharmacies, which do not require any capitalization requirements. And also, one of the board members believes that it's a hindrance for minorities and lower income applicants wanting to make a business, really eliminating any opportunity for small business. Again, with the way that the law is written, the caregivers have not been able to show any type of income from these overages. So there are a lot of ethical dilemmas when it comes to these current caregivers, knowing that overages that they sell are illegal, and assisting other caregivers to participate in the same activity. And overages, they cannot be claimed as income. However, we know that that is possibly what caregivers have been doing. And it is illegal business practice if that's what they've been doing. And maybe these caregivers have also been participating in some black market activity if their character is willing to take such great risk and commit federal crimes. So the big picture for the state of Michigan right now is that with these new proposed regulations, the job growth estimate is really outstanding. There's over 1,000 jobs before the end of 2008 in just the Lansing area, the capital area alone. It's estimated that potentially it'll be over 10,000 statewide jobs by the end of 2018, with revenue over $63 million per year going to counties and sheriffs and the state of Michigan general fund and schools as well. So the next steps, we'll see what happens and how this conversation goes. The next board meeting will be November 15th, 2017. And at the end of the October 15th meeting when these regulations were proposed, there was over 3 hours of questions to the board. And finally the board just put up a white flag and said that they were going to come back and answer more of these questions in the November meeting. So certainly there's a very engaged audience and a lot of community concern and interest in this conversation. Applications will be accepted starting December 15th with these new proposed regulations, and with hopes to approve them by December of 2008, or the first quarter of 2018. And also educating and advocating is something that really is a next step. The state of Michigan is offering classes to educate those interested on the laws and the proposals, and so far over 2,000 people have signed up just to be educated and understand what these regulations are all about. So I really appreciate your time, and I hope you learned something about this topic of medical marijuana regulations, specifically in the state of Michigan. Thank you so much.